Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining. I'm David Press, partner at Confluence Partners. We are a communication strategy firm that does lots of things, but we have a specialty in tech investing kind of across the investment spectrum, from philanthropies, public equities, and everything in between. So this is a conference of great interest to us. Imogen, and thank you for, the panels today are really terrific quality. This is the 5th year running, and I think it's the best ever. There are, in fact, 3 other panels at this time. I want to assure you that you've all chosen well. You made the right choice. This is the cities panel. How we think about our cities and transforming them is I think always one of the most engaging discussions here. And in part, that's because cities are something that we all kind of viscerally understand at a macro level. Anybody who rode here on the subway today understands some of the challenges that we face in our cities today. But cities also differ in terms of their challenges. It depends on where your city is. But we all need to be thinking about access to capital, access to jobs, better housing, transportation, some of these bigger issues where really investable ideas may offer a very real and perhaps a better solution. In fact, that is the focus of this discussion. What are some of the investable ideas that are out there in the marketplace today, and what ones should we be creating for tomorrow to make our cities better places to live? And on this panel with me, I have some terrific guests, each of whom is from an organization that is kind of working on different aspects of this problem, but all with investable solutions. So just going down the row here next to me, Ommeed Sathe. Sathe. Thank you. Vice President of Impact Investments at Prudential. For those of you that don't know, Prudential's been involved in impact for decades. Has a sizable program in Newark, actually, which we're going to be talking about momentarily. But one of the things that's quite interesting is they've got $1 billion of their own capital that's invested in some of these solutions. Olympia DeCastro, who's joining us from San Francisco, from Community Investment Management, which is really thinking about new ways, innovative ways to lend to small businesses. Many of those to date have been kind of in the fintech lending space. Then Lyneir Richardson, who is the CEO at Chicago Trends, but also a professor at Rutgers. And Chicago Trends takes I would say a retail focus and looks at retail development and how we can catalyze investment in retail to spur development in our cities. And finally, Greg Schell, who is joining us from Boston, and he is from Bain Capital. And as many of you may know, Bain's Double Impact Fund, which focuses on sustainability and health and wellness and community building, is $350 million and doing some very innovative work. So what we thought we'd do for today is everybody would kind of go down the row and talk to you a little bit about what their organizations are doing with cities. But then we thought we would do kind of a real test case discussion. And since Lyneir knows Newark very well, both from his Rutgers connection and the fact that he was the former head of economic development in Newark, and because Prudential is very invested and involved in Newark, we thought we would use Newark as a test case and actually talk through how these different solutions might play, and then kind of round back to what's missing from the discussion and what the future state, if we have time, might look like. And then I definitely want to leave some time for questions and comments. The nice thing about these panels at high water women is they're supposed to be interactive. So we'll try to get to all of that. So with that, why don't you kick things off?
Yeah, I mean, given the incredibly ambitious agenda, I'll go quickly. So I run or lead Prudential's impact investing activity. As David mentioned, it's over $1 billion commitment on the general account side, so that's all our own capital. We invested across a range of strategies. Almost all the assets are privates. We invest directly and indirectly. And I think part of what's interesting, I think, for the panel is a couple of ways in which sort of being headquartered in Newark has been very important, I think, candidly, to why the company has been willing to commit the level of resources to impact investing more generally. So when you experience and see some of the visceral and tangible manifestations of poverty on a daily basis, I think it changes your view both as to what sort of responsibility means, but also what opportunity means. And that our portfolio has a big allocation that is in Newark. It's not by any means all that's in the portfolio. It's about 25%. But it's been crucial in shaping the conversations internally. The other thing that I think is really important and interesting, though, is that our portfolio is multi-asset, multi-strategy. And so most people who've been looking at cities have done it primarily through a real estate lens. And that's a big part of what we have in the portfolio, but we also invest in a whole range of other strategies. And I think what's really interesting is how often there are deep synergies between the real estate and non-real estate investments, particularly in the context of cities, and that for actually making change, doing both is highly valuable.
Okay, so Community Investment Management is an investment firm that focuses on innovation in lending, responsible innovation in lending to small businesses and borrowers that are underserved. We find that through that lens, our portfolio has 2 to 3 times more minority, women-owned, and veteran-owned businesses. And a lot of our work is the focus on responsible and transparent lending, and we do that both through our investment as well as through advocacy efforts in the broader industry.
I think I had 2 minutes or less. 2 minutes or less. So, every day, I get up and think about how to make cities better. And, it started with this sort of thought about, can I help people see opportunity in people and places that other people sort of overlook or undervalue? That's been sort of my mission since, I got out of law school almost 27 years ago. And I've been able to do that most recently with a venture, Chicago Trend, which it's a startup social enterprise that we launched about a year ago that significantly raised $7 million of startup capital from 2 very prestigious impact investors and foundations. The strategy really is to understand neighborhoods and strengthen neighborhoods by looking not just in sort of the hot downtown area, the central core, but looking into neighborhoods and understanding how neighborhoods are changing and what things are needed to strengthen the neighborhood so that, tale of 2 cities, you start to address where there may be opportunity in neighborhoods. And so this is a strategy that has a predictive analytics and we've surveyed 17,000 people, 30,000 shopping trips, how people think about neighborhoods and its relationship to where they might move and where they might invest. That's really done with a co-founder who's an economic development thought leader, a guy named Bob Weisbord, and a firm out of Philadelphia, an econometrician, former Federal Reserve officer, Dick Voith. We have we call it real estate transaction facilitation element to our business, which is cultivating relationships both with national retailers, but also providing capacity building services to local entrepreneurs who might see opportunities in neighborhoods and understand their potential. And then thirdly, we call that our retailer coalition of the willing, and they're willing to see opportunity in neighborhoods. And then finally, using a $5 million place-based, really, PRI from the MacArthur Foundation. We've worked to structure transactions where we'd incentivize or reduce the risk of retailers and property owners to actually open new locations. And we say it's retail broadly defined. It's daycare and dry cleaners as well as Starbucks and Target. So our capital is either doing the build out for a new location or initial land acquisition. And it's interesting because we're 1 year into our operation in this sort of pilot phase. And we've identified probably 80% of the initial capital we have, and we're working to get that closed and ultimately to be able to show the impact around neighborhood change and new development and additional diversity of place and incomes, as well as that the retail is viable. So that'll be proved up. And our goal really is to raise more money. We want to raise $100 million to do this in other cities. This was specifically around Chicago, but the goal is to prove this model that the data analytics and the retailer relationship and the capital all survives. And then finally, as you mentioned, I have this dual role where after leaving economic development in Newark, I had a entrepreneurship center at Rutgers University in Newark. And Rutgers is an anchor institution, and it's the same connection between local entrepreneurs and their impact on neighborhoods. So it's capacity building programs for entrepreneurs. It's a laboratory where faculty members do research on the connection between entrepreneurship, largely minority entrepreneurship, and economic development in neighborhoods. So it's been a lot of fun. 2 minutes?
Perfectly fine.
I have this knack on panels of getting behind the wrong person, or in this case, the wrong people. I should have tried to get on a different panel this morning. Good morning, everyone. I'm Greg Schell. I co-lead the Bain Capital Double Impact Strategy. We are a $350 million lower middle market private equity fund focused on 3 impact sectors. We went out with a strategy to focus on health and wellness, on sustainability, 2 sectors that we think have inherent impact in them. About a third area of focus that we call community building, and this was really a place-based strategy where we are trying to find companies who can be catalytic in areas of chronic underemployment. One of the things that we love about this particular strategy is what I think we're talking about here, is that one of the issues with cities isn't just the fact that we have poverty and inequity and so forth, but it's persistent and intractable and self-reinforcing. And so one of the things that we hope to drive in this first fund is the ability to produce reference cases where our capital, in this case, can be catalytic to doing some pretty unique things. One example would be to spin out a division of a company, and change its factors of production or its headquarters to soak up some of the sort of unemployment and underemployment. We are looking at targeting specific cities, whether it's a Detroit or coal country or other rural areas, to do things that are important to be done, whether it's wiring for high speed access, or frankly just having the opportunity to employ low and middle skilled folks. We think all of these things have the potential to drive significant impact, and so it's a big way that we're focusing our time. You all will have the pleasure, I will not today, of seeing Deval Patrick as your keynote speaker today, who's a founder and leader of this fund. Many of you would know him as the sort of former 2-term governor of Massachusetts. He personally, not only conceives of the whole fund, but is thinking about our community building strategy as a big piece of his personal time. So we're looking for these opportunities to drive real success stories in places where we just haven't seen anywhere near enough of those. So that's the contribution we hope to make to the field.
So, Greg, why don't we stay with you?
Stay with me, all right.
And that way everybody will follow you this time.
All right, that's fine.
So stay on that for a moment. I think when a lot of us think of cities and the types of investments that have to come, they're not necessarily thinking about investable solutions. So what's the entry point, say, for an impact investor in cities?
What's the entry point?
What's the entry point?
It's such a broad question. Let me tell
And
you
how do
we're
you
thinking
see
about
those
We are
opportunities?
generally rolling 10 to 50 equity, $1 million equity checks into lower middle market companies who have $5 million to $25 million in EBITDA. So these are companies, who in many cases are looking for scaled equity for the first time. And part of what we think our expertise is to be able to contribute a lot of, strategy and business development and operations support to help them truly scale. And we think it's at that point where we can deliver our greatest value. We would make the observation that a lot of folks in the impact field, most of whom came in, earlier than us and to whom we owe a great debt of gratitude, are looking for the sort of check stage and size earlier than us. So we're writing smaller checks into earlier stage companies. What we hope to do is to be the company who really is incredibly focused on mission orientation and helping those same companies in many cases scale and take their next steps. And we thought that when we were conceiving of the fund that there was an empty space in that. When it comes to cities, I think we are looking for places where you have sort of market failures or where capital isn't flowing in places where it should. And in many cities, you have sort of built-in advantages, whether it's transportation nodes or available real estate, as my colleague has mentioned, or in many cases, abundance of labor, much of it at reasonable cost. These things ought to be attracting business, and they're not. What we're seeing is people doubling and tripling down, on highly developed urban, Manhattan, or Boston or San Francisco or whatever, and leaving all of these incredible opportunities for commerce, and frankly, most of the country. And for us, we see an enormous market opportunity. So the gateway for us is really to find that real sense of mission, that real commitment to the kind of people and communities that we hope to serve, and frankly the kind of commercial potential that allows for us to do right by our LPs, of course, but one that lends itself to our skill set where we could help them to be the finest business that they could be. I would tell you in all candor that our check size in many cases is bigger than some of these businesses who we've fallen in love with. One of them is in the room, actually. And frankly, we are waiting for all this growth and all this promise to meet us where we are, and we're stretching, to sort of meet them where they are.
Growing as fast as I can, man.
But the place that we occupy, I think, allows us to find companies who we think, given our resources, can help become scaled companies. And so that we're excited about that, but we're early in our fund life, and we've not had an opportunity. We've made 3 investments, but we haven't had one that we would define as a sort of classic community, community building opportunity to ship. But we will find that those opportunities, and we won't miss them.
Olympia, I'm curious. I think your starting point for Sim is slightly different. Could you talk about that and the eventual interplay, say, with an equity player?
Sure. So I guess I would take a step back and think about, it's been interesting listening to what the focus here is in terms of job creation and, the entrepreneurship and these businesses. And so I think we should look at kind of, what has happened to cities and why they are in this position. And mainly, there's been a structural shift on what these cities look like, and I like to use the example that I heard recently, where cities like Akron, Ohio, that used to be called the rubber capital of the world, and you had, 3 large companies, Goodyear and 2 others, that created all the jobs there. Now, these cities have changed, and in their place is 3,000, 4,000 small businesses. And so, there's this shift that has occurred, but at the same time, there's a gap that exists at many levels. One of the levels that I see a lot is the disappearance of community development banks. And so there's been less lending for these small businesses available, and even the type of lending that exists is one that is more traditional based, where they're looking at collateral, and there's an additional shift to small businesses that and the economy in general, that these tend to be services based businesses. So we're talking about dry cleaners or healthcare, or the schools. And so these services-based businesses don't have collateral. They're not traditionally lend themselves to the type of financing that is out there. And so we have been focused on looking at the innovation that's taking place around lending. There's a lot of data that exists out there because of all the technology, and there's many other ways that you can lend using very credit-worthy decisions that it's not it's not exactly what banks are doing, but it's still sound. These folks should be able to get capital, and so we see in our portfolio FICO scores of 700, but they tend to be small businesses, and the average loan size is about 90,000, and so I think that I want to take one more step back. I think that capital is in everything. So it's about, creating the economic growth. I mean, some small businesses don't need capital per se, but it's about creating the economic stimulus so that they grow, into a business. And then there's the need for scalable capital. And then finally, maybe they grow to a size where they graduate to bank funding or the types of investment opportunities that Bain is seeing. So it's maybe it's philanthropy plus. CDFIs have a great role. Then scalable innovation lending that we're very much behind, and then banks and more traditional types of lending that's available.
So that's an interesting point. The capital isn't everything, and Ommeed, I think you made a very interesting point on a conversation we had about sort of some of the perspective that Prudential has in Newark. That I think you used the term capital plus engagement, and I'd be interested in building on this idea.
Yeah, so thank you for that. So one of the things I think is really interesting about sort of what Greg and Olympia are doing is to think about the role of businesses ultimately in cities, and that for a long time, we've sort of relegated this notion of anchor institutions just to eds and meds, but corporates are a big part of that. And actually sort of encouraging that kind of sense of purpose has been a big part. I'm looking at Mark here in Aerofarms, right? They go out of their way, I think, to really make their location in Newark not a liability, but a genuine asset in driving company culture, in shaping a lot of formative values. And I think it does actually matter when you look at some of these, smaller cities that are not New York and San Francisco, that the companies there are really rooted in those towns. And having investors, I think, who encourage that sense of purpose has been a huge part of Prudential's story and staying in Newark. And so I think actually opening up that conversation on what sort of the responsibility of businesses are in society is a big part of that. And what makes it then interesting to your question is that it's not just staying in a town and having labor. The perspective that, large successful businesses bring is often crucial in shaping public policy. So Lyneir and I worked together, and where I served on the board of the city's economic development agency. And the perspectives you're bringing, I think, are absolutely vital for competing in the 21st century. And so there's a lot that business can do just at sort of engaging not only on the investment side of things, but on the policy levers, supporting nonprofit institutions. We have a huge pro bono service program that has placed not just sort of our rank and file employees on nonprofits, but almost all of our senior leaders serve on major nonprofit institutions in the city. That's a big part of what sort of engagement means. And then on the investment side, I think what's nice about particularly smaller cities, I think New York, Chicago, a few other places are probably too big for this to be the case, but the problems are ultimately practical. So potholes need to be filled, garbage needs to be picked up. There is an ability, I think, to problem solve. And leadership really matters. It's not all abstract. And so much of our work, ultimately the economics would be the same, irrespective to some extent of who did it. But the outcomes, the social benefits, the way in which things are done is radically shaped by engagement. And I think that's the big thing that's really interesting at cities, that you can shape those levers.
So talk about that for a moment, because it's, you obviously Prudential obviously made the decision that you wanted to invest your own capital in these solutions. So what are some of the advantages? I would suspect there are certain advantages and flexibilities that gives Prudential.
Yeah, so we've become, especially in Newark, we've become much more heavily involved as an equity investor to have that control. And I think that's what's been, ultimately really powerful is that, when you're a lender in any form or fashion, you're somewhat beholden to what the operator wants to do. Once you sign on as a major LP, often sort of the only LP or sort of the primary LP, all of a sudden you get to do a lot of things you want to do. And that's real power in terms of shaping outcomes. So I'll give you an example. When we've done development projects in Newark, we've really insisted that they all be mixed income. And, there's a set of incentives that make affordable housing work in this country, but it doesn't dictate that you're going to do that. And I think sort of insisting upon that, insisting upon who retail gets rented to, what happens with local hiring in terms of retail spaces that you build into the building. All of those are of incredible significance to the community and are all operational choices that have no direct negative or positive, actually, impact on the economics, but don't always happen as of right. And so I think that's a big space in which becoming involved in the ownership, you can shape design, you can shape income mix, you can shape retail utilization, you can shape small business preferences relative to big box. There's a whole range of things that happen that I think are really interesting.
Thank you. So, Lyneir, it would be interesting to have your perspective on the retail development and staying on Newark, since we've naturally gravitated there. One of the things I was wondering is how do you make decisions to attract new merchants, or in this case, to retail, in a city like Newark, and ensure somehow that they stay the mom and pop merchants. That I think everybody who lives in some of the bigger cities has seen. Look at New York. It's it's just chain stores now, chain restaurants. We've lost a lot of, we've gentrified, and there are downsides to that gentrification. So how do we prevent that from happening? But how do we drive the
and so often in urban economic development, I always think it's not either or, it's sort of and so our strategy is looked at what's needed to strengthen a commercial corridor, what's needed to make a neighborhood where people could actually rationally choose to live in, invest in, open a business in. The work around, should there be national retailers, is a business attraction game. It's presenting an argument. It's working with their data analytics team. It's working with their site selectors. It's sometimes working even at the C-suite level to convince them that this is an opportunity they should pursue for a variety of reasons. The regional and local retailers is more of a capacity building exercise. It's or identifying a retailer that's successful in one part of a city or in one part of the city or in another city, and convincing them that this is an opportunity they should pursue, and providing the capital to incentivize that, to reduce some of the risk, to fill the gap where a property owner may not want to lease to a local entrepreneur, but or provide the build out capital for that local entrepreneur. So you're putting that capital in to try to seed it to make it happen. So again, it's the analysis begins with what's happening in the neighborhood. What's the opportunity? How is it changing? Who sees this as an opportunity? What else is is the city making investment? Are the other private investment things happening? Is there a local nonprofit organization, or is there a CDFI? We partner in Chicago with a very reputable CDFI. And so as we look to other cities, is there a CDFI that sees opportunity there? And so you're leveraging almost any little aspect of strength and looking for a nuance that will say we can build from here, and a retailer that could come would be profitable. Finally, in our work in Newark, and I saw this in my work before coming to Newark, getting those retailers there is one accomplishment. Keeping them open and making sure that they are hopefully successful, and is another exercise. And so we opened a new movie theater in Newark, and I always tell my friends, all right, we celebrated this big ribbon cutting. We now got to go see a movie there. Right? And so that's an economic development job, right? And so it's that work of, you want the new coffee shop to be successful. There's a cool new coffee shop right behind Prudential there. We go over there for coffee every day, right? And so it's those little things that are all part of the process.
Greg, I'm curious from Bain Capital's perspective, how involved you feel you need to be, or what your perspective is on sort of some of these broader implications of the investments, the public policy side, and how those factor into some of your investment decisions, and what needs to take place in the different cities.
Yeah, it's a fascinating question. I've gotten some hard ones. Let me see what to do with this one. I guess one of the most the thing that gets me the most excited, frankly, about this topic is for us to use our capital to help explode some of the myths that exist around how economic development happens, should happen, or can happen. And in this case, I think we've been sort of, as a society, sort of utterly convinced that the role of business is somehow disconnected from the communities in which they reside, right? And so at best, and there's lots of great, corporate actors, of course, but even many of them see themselves as sort of having a black box business model, with which they then go to somehow mitigate some of the, nasty things can sometimes occur in the world. And I think we've seen, over the last several years, a different kind of, consensus, I think, emerging, which is which has at least two major tenets of it. One, and Ommeed touched on this a little bit, which is you're not separate from the context, right? You're a part of the context, number one. And in many cases, and Olympia made the example of Akron. In many cases, you are the context, right? Number one. And number two, I think, is so you can't divorce yourself from it. But the second thing is equally as important, which is to say, being a good actor actually ends up being good for business. And I think that piece is the one that I think many companies have struggled the most with. It all depends on what math you do. An example, I'd heard the CEO of Aetna in the middle of this sort of debate around minimum wage. So public policy discussion, as you asked me about. Take a different tact on this question and raise the minimum wage voluntarily. And the idea, for many would be like, my goodness, you're exposing yourself to this expense that you didn't have to, and all else equal, shareholders are worse off, because you're now paying for labor. And what he was able to do was just do the different math. That math is available to all companies, right, to be thinking in different ways. But he's like, I started thinking about how much turnover we have because we're effectively hiring an unmotivated, very poorly skilled, and trained, professional who in many cases does a bad job. It hurts our brand, in the front of the house, and our customers are disappointed in us. In many ways, by paying, more money, he went from, it was a big number, went from, like $7 to $12 or something like that. So pretty decent jump. By definition, created a different kind of, workplace culture, more highly motivated, secure, professional, who was less distracted by the problems, and mitigates the required of sort of really low income, and so on. You see where I'm going. Same context, and I think what he saw in his company was that the company spent less money on a different kind of employee and was a better employer. What we're trying to do is to find mission-oriented leadership in many cases who see themselves as both part of a context, a big part of a context, number one, and then number two, so public policy, they clearly care about it, but number two, see behaving in these ways as being highly effective to creating a better business with, frankly, a more expansive commercial opportunity. And for those companies who are convinced by that, they're immediately attractive to us. Our fund is a tiny fund in the world of private equity, but we will have the opportunity to display something that I think will matter over the life of the fund, because we're going to hold out these vignettes and say this can be done at scale. We'll come back out to the market and hopefully get support for a much bigger fund and do hopefully some things that I described at the beginning, spinning out chunks of public companies, moving them, intentionally into places where they can both be really great businesses, but also do some things that we think are highly important as well. So that's, I think that's the long answer. The short answer is absolutely we are thinking a broad array of societal concerns, including opportunities for public policy. Are we true advocates? Are we lobbying? That's not what we're doing. Right. We're buying companies and trying to grow them, but we clearly pay attention to the rest of the context.
Now, what about some of the other issues that we can't really have a discussion about cities without talking about diversity and things like, education. I think Sim has, uses a really interesting diversity lens towards some of your investments. Maybe you could talk about that, and I think it'd be interesting to hear all of your perspectives on how for-profit solutions should be thinking about those issues or can think about those issues.
Sure. So what we've found is that a majority of small businesses, or I should say a majority of women-owned businesses, minority-owned businesses are small, right? And so they lack access to capital because of that. We through this innovation that that has been taking place, particularly innovation in lending, particularly on the fintech side. We have seen thousands of lenders emerge with solutions to reach these small businesses. Some of them, and I just want to get to this policy bit a little bit and then get to the diversity, but some of them are doing it in responsible ways, and some of them are doing it in more predatory ways. And so we, have come in very much with a lens of trying to use, making sure that this innovation is being used in a way that has a long-term goal, right, where the sustainability of the small business is very much in mind, and that obviously of the investor, because giving loans to companies that they can actually afford is good business sense. But so the point is, so we come in, we're fun, we look at all these platforms that are providing these solutions and are reaching now these small businesses with responsible loans. And what we've found is that our portfolio then reflects what we see in terms of small businesses out there. So there's about 38% of women-owned businesses are women-owned. 28% of those are employer firms. If you look at traditional banks, they, in dollar terms, reach 4% of their portfolio is women-owned businesses. So as opposed to 28, let's say, of the employer firms. And in dollar-wise, it's about, number-wise, it's about 14. We see 20% of our loans in dollars are to women-owned businesses, and 28, which is a mirror of the amount of small business employer firms, women-owned, that are out there. And so these solutions are reaching minorities and are reaching women and veterans. In fact, we have one platform that is entirely focused on veterans, because each one of these also has to these lenders are thinking about innovative ways to reach small businesses. Customer acquisition is very difficult. How do you get a small business to know that you're there? And that becomes a very expensive component of it. And so these guys focus as veterans as the affiliate channel for them, targeting that. And then they also bring in the lender component. So they have a Reg A out where it's veterans funding veterans, and the business itself is veteran run. And so they're able to reach these veterans. And they've also found that eventually the repayment changes, the attitude towards repayment, because whereas someone would default and they'll call them up and say, well, you realize you're defaulting on a veteran. And so they say, wait, that's the first payment I want to make, is to my fellow veteran. So there's very interesting models out there that are reaching these segments. And so it's, we work hard at supporting that with responsible loans.
Ommeed, I'm just curious, with respect to some of the bigger issues like diversity, education, how Prudential factors those into some of your decisions.
Yes, great question. So one of the things that we've done that I'm very proud of, actually, is we created this thing around sort of inclusive venture capital. And the way we're looking at it, I think, which Pru's not really a venture capital investor, you don't typically associate big insurance companies with that. But if you look at the stats around sort of venture capital, it's absolutely disgusting, right? I mean, it's 1% of companies are led by African Americans, 7% by women. And not surprisingly, venture capital funds have exactly the same demographic makeup. Literally 1% of venture capital partners are African American and 7% are women. So like the trickle down in the sort of confluence is pretty profound. So we've made a big effort to sort of support diverse managers. But that wasn't actually just enough in the venture space. I think two other things we've done that are pretty important is I think we've targeted managers to actually set up operations in diverse communities, right? So that actually, it can be a non-diverse manager, but if they're based in Newark, they're based in Oakland. So we've launched a Newark Venture Partners, which is something that we did in tandem with Audible, which created sort of a place-based venture capital fund in Newark. We invested in something similar in the West Coast. So that's a second theme. And then the third theme is to actually look for managers who are investing in solutions that help diverse communities, right? So that's the other thing that doesn't happen is that not only are there inequities in representation, but there's inequities in business model development. And so I think looking at all three has been pretty interesting for us, all under the sort of same umbrella. And so I think that's one thing we've done. The other thing that I think we've been really fortunate to be able to do is to have a great relationship with our philanthropic colleagues at Prudential who have been able to look at issues like education that may or may not have a natural investable. So we do a lot of charter school lending, but the actual operational side is trickier. And so it's been really nice to sort of look at sectors in a collaborative way.
I'd love to open it up before we break for lunch. I'd love to open it up. Any questions?
You want me to go to the mic?
Sure, if you don't mind.
I'm intrigued about these pioneer investments in urban areas where one of the real challenges for companies locating there is lack of workforce, and how a partnership that I've tried to create, it's in a rural environment involving universities, small companies, capstone courses for engineering students who not only apprentice at the companies, but they also solve a business problem. So taking Bain's idea about trying to get companies to migrate to the right places, what I'm struck by is Prudential is more holistic in the approach because you're focused in a geography. But if you could recruit the right type of companies that would invest in, but then you would, I guess my bigger question is how you create the ecosystem for success, because it's going to be very hard to get companies to go into the neighborhoods you're talking about where the workforce is not ready for this. And how do we scale to that, and are the ideas that the panel might have on how to address that challenge?
It's an important question. Let me take it from two directions. I think the first, I've actually been surprised by some data I'd see, and this is actually a Boston context, so I don't know to what extent it's universal. But the data I expected to find exactly that. But what I have found actually is that the number of training programs, the number of sort of credentialed, in a variable, workforce is actually higher than I would have thought, and higher than the businesses think. Instead, what you see is a very insidious, problem, which is a lot of these people have downskilled, and there's a sort of barista effect where people who went to school for or got training in or went to a not-for-profit, context to get a credential have not been able to find opportunity, in the downtown area, and there are lots of reasons for that, and some of them have to do with what has been said, frankly, about the trickle-down effect or not. That's a big problem. I hope to find, and we work very hard at finding, the opposite, frankly, which is that companies will be surprised by the context that they find in the communities that are available to them. I think what they'll find actually is that the available labor there probably needs to be on the margin, trained and skilled maybe a little bit more than the downtown context, but they're actually far easier to find and to do that exercise than to trip on themselves or pay double, to find employees or to move them from other cities. It is a challenge. I'm not saying that it's not, but you're sort of going to be picking a challenge, one or the other. I think the other piece of the question that I think is really important here is to what degree is it wise for each of us to try to lift the earth by ourselves, and to what degree is there opportunities to be much more collaborative along the dimension of these problems? Are we not able to hit the same problem if we were more coordinated? And I'm incredibly struck by that, and it's making me think. As soon as I get a pen after the panel, there's some thoughts that you've made me have that I want to write down. But that, to me, strikes me as a really big opportunity, which is maybe there's a conversation to be had about, hey, this is our thought process, and the resources we have to throw against it. Here's some interesting targets. There are public-private opportunities. There are sort of cross investor entities that make this more possible. And this is an innovative story that ought to be told that's not yet being told. But it's much more because we're not thinking that way, as opposed to there not being a true opportunity that exists. So I'm really focused on helping blow up those myths.
It's a really great initiative. Sounds like you're working on it. I think something that's potentially really interesting is if you look at a lot of the work, and I know Greg's done some really interesting stuff on sort of rapid reskilling. And so we have an investment in sort of a large kind of coding school, but that's actually shifted business models to essentially working with enterprises who have realized that they have slightly different needs than sort of a generic training program, and they also have a huge existing labor force that needs to be reskilled. It would kind of shock you to know what the average age of the IT people are at Prudential. It's definitely not 25. And I don't think we're alone in having a lot of sort of great employees whose skills are a little bit out of date and can be rapidly reskilled. And so there's a lot of interesting things going on with rapid reskilling. But the other side of this coin, right, is that we have made places like New York and San Francisco so cost prohibitive that for anybody in sort of a middle skills job, companies actually need to look, to your point, it's one challenge or the other, right? It's either you're not going to pay enough to people to have a life here or have 2-hour commutes, or you find a way to reskill someone in a much lower cost market. And so I think there are real business pressures pushing people to try to look at markets in which, again, it doesn't have to be the New York great, New York and San Francisco have fantastic talent pools. They also have 1,000 people competing for that same talent pool and forcing wages to a place that are unsustainable. Yeah.
May I ask who, generically, your investors are and how you fit within the larger Bain capital private equity effort?
May I ask? Sure. Briefly, 100% of our early money really did come from family wealth, family offices, wealth advisory firms, or multifamilies. Because of that early start, which we're very grateful for, we began to appeal toward endowments and foundations for sure, and migrated to sort of real institutional players and public pensions. We've got a really nice LP mix in our fund. But the bedrock of it, even though they were smaller dollar amounts at the start, were family offices and family wealth.
Therefore, so the limitation is just your proving your thesis rather than investor interest in your fund.
When you say limitation, what do you mean?
For growth.
I think a well-articulated. We went with. I mentioned we are a small pool of capital by a large private equity standard. I think what we found in the fundraise was that there is a significant amount of capital available for a truly commercial rate of return with a series of well-articulated impact stories that could be verified and measured. We'll be able to raise a lot more money. So we don't see a growth limitation. I think we are 100% focused on doing what we said we would do and not thinking too much about what can come after that. Once we do what we're supposed to do, there's a lot of capital who would love to offer that to their pensioners or to their client.
So when you're looking at potential investments and evaluating the extent to which they'll be beneficial to a given community, how do you bring in the voices of the people who are in that community?
Great question for us. So, our approach is really to partner with, sort of local developers and local entrepreneurs. We see ourselves as both facilitators, as expediters, and then using the capital to fill a gap. So we are not initiating, development projects de novo. We're finding entrepreneurs or finding minority developers who've have an opinion about a neighborhood, and they come to us and they say, we've been working on this, can you help us figure out how to get the right retailer in place? We sort of follow them into community meetings. We follow them into the, discussions with the local elected officials. Again, our goal is, we're trying to accelerate the completion of a transaction. We did some initial research, and it takes 5 to 7 years in many instances to get a new a new sort of transformative project done in some of the urban environments. So our question was, what could we do to take 2 years out of that, right? If we had a relationship with the retailer, if we had some data analytic capacity that could show a new, provide a new lens or a new narrative, and then, use the capital that was flexible, subordinate, that would back either a developer with an idea or a minority entrepreneur. So, this question of what goes first, to me, it starts with who's boots on the ground, and we're trying to be as close to that entrepreneur or that developer there to help them achieve, the vision. We're not creating the vision, we're trying to expedite it.
I think I'm just going to add one thing. In terms of what we've seen in fintech and lending, I think the neat thing there, particularly in the small business space, is that all the different capital needs of small businesses are so different, and these players are really able to look and provide a product solution. So a lot of the innovation taking place is in the product, and developing a product that actually meets the need of the small business. And so we've seen everything from the more plain vanilla term loan loan to multi-draw type line of credit type facilities, or maybe it's working capital, inventory finance, or the processor, the payment processor that provides a line. And so we've seen an array of different type of products that are able to reach the different needs that all these different small businesses have.
But we put one thing that's a little bit controversial out here. One of the things that I think is going wrong with cities today is that there is a very narrow set of voices, and I think they're disproportionately skewed to residential voices. And so two things happen that I think are systematically bad for society. One, we are under-densifying cities chronically across this country, right? It is embarrassing how few people, sitting here in New York think New York's in the middle of a building boom. You know how many units New York permitted last year? It was 20,000 units. It sounds like a big number. That'll hold 40,000 people. New York City's added 50,000 people for the last 7 years, right? So New York City can't build even to keep up with growth, let alone put a dent on affordability. So we've chronically underbuilt our most desirable, most successful locations. And part of that is that there's unbelievable power in the political process for existing residential owners who therefore systematically exclude poor and vulnerable populations from being able to participate, and the whole middle, of course. And then the other element to this is that I think business stakeholders are busy. They're running a dry cleaning business. They're running a coffee shop. They're not going to show up at community forums. And they're, again, huge beneficiaries of sensible development policy. So I do think it is a careful slope, I would say, to be on sort of how to do participation right, as opposed to sort of lead to sort of systematically NIMBYist policies.
Sounds like lunch may be ready, so maybe another couple of quick questions. Did you have one, Matt?
Sure, yeah. I'm Deborah Brodheim. I'm with Playworks, so a shout out to Newark, where we've been there for 7 years, and the changes that have gone on have been tremendous. I've been struck, though, working there, that what goes on with an incredible transportation hub, a huge population of workers there, but you still have a lot of people who are commuting in. It's hard for them to get engaged directly with what's going on in the neighborhoods, in the local schools, and I've seen a few companies that have gotten more involved in, Pru has been one of them, Audible is another, an effort to get their people out of their offices and out in their communities. But how do you deal with this issue, and more broadly, with people commuting in from outside to these cities and actually getting more directly engaged in their communities?
So I'll be very quick. So I used to say if I could get people to spend a half an afternoon with me on the street, they'll see opportunity for themselves. So it really is, getting people across the water, getting out of their car, getting out of the office, walking the street. They'll say, "Oh, this reminds me of a project I saw done in Brooklyn," or "This reminds me of a renovation that I've witnessed in some other place that I could invest in." So, boy, the school, it reminds me of a school where people have seen grow. So much of the work was just getting people to actually touch and feel. And I actually believe that's happening now in Newark in a very broad way. You just see people walking around. There's more restaurants that are opening up. There's more entertainment options. Getting people to live there so that it really is, if not 24/7, it's 18/6 or whatever. So, getting people out after 5. All of those things are starting to come together in a way that's I'm seeing the city become more viable. And again, I believe that work is transferable to other neighborhoods, to other places, the same type of strategy.
I would just thought something that I think that Deborah's in the back there, and I think something that's interesting that is tricky in Newark, and I think tricky probably in a lot of cities, is that as we've lost local media, we've lost sort of one of the natural organs that sort of builds a sense of how people can participate and find out what's going on. And I do think, I worked in New Orleans before, and that was a radical difference, right? I mean, the Times-Picayune, it's the two cities essentially the same size, but the Times-Picayune meant that any single thing we did, everyone knew about. Anything we do in Newark, there's a 1 in 100 chance it gets picked up in the New York Times, literally. And I suspect that same story is playing out in communities across the country, and I think that's a big part of, I don't know what replaces local media, but it's a struggle.
I think there's one other question over here. Go ahead, please.
I have a million questions, so I'm going to shout at me.
Yeah.
The first question I have for the panel is, so I have a professional one and a personal one. The professional one is, I'd love everyone's opinion on what Amazon is doing with their, are they trying to hijack a city, or are they trying to really build a city, and how they're going about it. I'd love your opinion on that. And then second, if you're a mid-career professional who's interested in becoming, moving into urban development, what would, how should someone proceed? What would be good things to learn? What's the way to go about career change into urban development?
I'm gonna take the first one, so you guys take the hard one.
On the career change, I think one of the things that's great for people looking to come in and do work in cities is to do something in the public or quasi-public sector, because it's important to understand that context, and it'll give context for sort of how political actors, and again, because it's cities, like those political dimensions are very tangible and very real, and also not as systematically awful as people may think from the outside either, right? I mean, there's a logic and a lot of integrity that also goes on, and I think so sometimes people are either too cynical or not cynical enough, but having that feel, I think, is a good skill set. You guys take the hard question.
No, and so I'll do 30 seconds on each. He's right. I had been a corporate, I was an entrepreneur, and then I worked for a big corporate. When Cory Booker was mayor, when I interviewed with him, I always joked at my last interview with a tear in his eye. He said, we have all these things announced, and we just need to get stuff done, right? And so my opportunity there was to take stuff from the pipeline to the finish line. And so all my corporate training, I was able to sort of use the judgment about, is this a good developer? Is this the proper use of incentive? How do we advocate for the incentive? And that sort of business experience was valued in sort of a quasi-governmental role that we ultimately changed. Amazon, I wrote an article about 2 weeks ago in the New Jersey, this New Jersey business, New Jersey versions of Cranes, that really, my view was, if you looked on balance over time, what the cities are offering to Amazon as incentives, over time, it would balance out. You would get a return on investment in terms of job creation, in terms of what happens in neighborhoods, in terms of additional business attraction. That on balance, if you put a 10-year or 20-year lens on it, it doesn't look like a hijack. When you say Newark's going to give Amazon, is offering Amazon $5 billion, that sounds like what's the city doing? But if you look at it on over time in terms of tax credits and the return on parking revenue and additional shopping and restaurants, additional investment, additional payroll taxes earned over time, sales taxes earned over time, that it wasn't a hijacking. That's my view. I think anybody else is going to try it. Come on. Don't look at me.
Alexa, if you're listening, come to Boston. Come to Boston. Look, it's really complex. There are multiple layers, but aren't we ending where we started, right? Which is the fact that Goodyear and two companies we couldn't remember left Akron, and left this void. And in the end, my sense is companies, on balance, ought to go where they belong, right? Where their available labor either is trained or can be trained for what they do. And you get to this point where, because many companies follow that, there becomes this other opportunity that's revealed on the other side, and that natural balancing is what we all aim for. The problem isn't that. The problem is that balance is broken. The problem is that we unfortunately think we are this dynamic upwardly mobile society, and the data simply does not tell you that, and it hasn't told you that for a long time. We are instead more like a caste system. In other words, you're born into a context that you mostly don't change. And so what you mostly see is for cities who have an adverse event, like a big foundational corporate leave them, they literally have a very difficult time reinventing themselves. So to the extent that there are big growthy opportunities like at Amazon or literally anything like it, I would be very slow to pick apart that as a negative and really stay focused on all the opportunities for individual employment advancement and so forth, and then all of the things that tend to happen around these waves. There are small ripples. There's a food truck, for whom Amazon coming to their town is literally the best day. So it's multi-layered. I'd be slow to critique it. I'd be very focused on trying to shape it and make sure that your RFP conforms to the kind of city you hope to be. I'm never convinced, with all due respect to all the methodologies about how many jobs and how much this tax credit and the return on it. I've seen them. I've taken part in them. The bigger question to me is about what kind of community do you want to be, and to what extent does the investments conform to that? Because if you don't know what kind of city you want to be, then of course they're going to hijack you because there's not alignment there. But
hello,
yeah.
Hello, Jeff.
Newark.
And there's I can't help but tout our own home here, but there's a nice piece by Richard Florida, I think, talking a little bit about sort of Amazon and Prudential that's on City Lab that I think is kind of an interesting piece that people might want to look at.
Everybody, thank you.
Thank you all.
Thanks to the panel.